All right, so welcome to another deep dive.
Excited to be here.
Today we're going to be exploring trans identity in the digital world,
Yeah.
and I think it's going to be really, really interesting. We're going to be looking at excerpts from my personal essay,
Okay.
and it's called From Gray to Light, Trans as Origin and Destination
Mm.
by Jaime Hoerricks, PhD. And it's a really interesting piece because it's kind of a mix of like personal narrative and social commentary,
Yeah.
and there's even some poetry in there.
Interesting.
Now, just to give you a little bit of context about the author, Hoerricks identifies as both trans and autistic.
Okay.
And that really plays a big role in shaping their online experiences, which we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, I think that's what makes this essay so compelling, It's that they use their own personal experience as a way to kind of look at these bigger societal issues,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to online spaces and these digital platforms that we're all kind of,
Yeah.
interacting with all the time now.
Yeah, for sure. And so the essay starts off with this really, really interesting anecdote. It's about a meme.
Yeah.
So it seems simple enough, right?
Right.
But for Hoerricks, encountering this meme on like a particularly rough day, it actually triggered all this anxiety
Yeah.
and then eventually led to them writing this really powerful poem in response to it.
It's so interesting how something that seems so like simple or trivial
Yeah.
can actually spark such a really strong emotional response and also a creative response too.
Right.
But I think that kind of speaks to the power of memes in a way.
Yeah.
Right? Like they might seem superficial on the surface, but often I think they reflect like really deeply held
Right.
societal beliefs and attitudes about things.
Absolutely, yeah. And in this particular instance, the meme that Hoerricks encountered was actually perpetuating all these really harmful stereotypes about trans identity, and specifically like reducing it to this really simple before and after binary.
Of transitioning, and that's something that they really push back against throughout the entire essay.
Yeah.
They really emphasize the complexity and the fluidity
Yeah.
of trans experiences.
Right, and this ties into one of the kind of the central concepts in the essay, which is this idea of trans as both origin and destination.
I love that.
Yeah, and I think it's really about challenging this notion that transitioning is just, this straightforward linear journey
Right.
from point A to point B, It's
Yeah.
like, oh, you were this, now you're this.
Right.
And instead, what Hoerricks is arguing is that transness is actually like this inherent part of a person's identity.
Mhm.
It's there from the very beginning.
Okay, so it's not like it becoming something different. It's like a
Right. It's like,
Yeah.
it's almost like, I don't know, if you think about like a seed that
right.
holds the potential for a flower, right? The flower isn't like a new thing.
Right.
It's always been present within that seed.
Mhm.
And so similarly, for a lot of trans people, transitioning is really about,
Blossoming into the person they've always been.
Yeah, I love that analogy. It's such a beautiful way to think about it.
Yeah.
Like that unfolding,
Exactly. And Hoerricks actually uses some really powerful language to kind of convey this idea in the essay.
Okay.
And one quote that really stood out to me was, they say, "My transness was not born the moment I began transitioning. It has always been a part of me, an intrinsic aspect of my identity."
I mean, wow, that's powerful.
Yeah.
And it really makes you think about the dominant narratives that we often hear
Yeah.
around trans identity, right?
I wish
It's so often focused on the physical aspects of transitioning rather than this really internal experience of
Yes.
self-discovery and self-actualization.
Exactly. And I think, this brings us to another really important theme in the essay, which is this idea of the cis gaze
Okay.
and how it kind of plays out online.
Okay.
And so Hoerricks argues that online platforms and algorithms, oftentimes they're actually designed in a way that reinforces, cis-heteronormative views and binaries.
So you're saying that even when we're not like actively engaging with transphobic content,
Right.
like the very structure of these platforms can still perpetuate harm and exclusion?
Unfortunately, yes.
Wow.
Yeah, it's it's kind of baked into the system in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And so, if you think about how social media feeds work, right? It's like
Yeah.
they often show you more of what you already engaged with, which makes sense on one level.
Right.
But it can create these echo chambers, right?
Yeah.
Where certain viewpoints, like cis-heteronormative perspectives,
Yeah.
get amplified, while other perspectives might get silenced or suppressed.
Right. So for someone like Horrocks who, exists outside that statistical mean, meaning their experiences don't align with these dominant norms,
Right.
it sounds like navigating these spaces can be really challenging.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of effort to constantly filter through that content and try to find spaces that feel genuinely inclusive
Right.
and affirming.
Yeah. I imagine it's exhausting to
Yeah.
constantly be doing that work.
Absolutely. And Hoerricks talks about feeling, overwhelmed, anxious,
Yeah.
when encountering content that triggers those feelings of otherness or exclusion.
And that actually reminds me of something that Hoerricks mentioned about their experience as an autistic person.
Okay.
They talked about how these algorithms can actually exacerbate feelings of isolation and overwhelm, especially for people who are already sensitive to sensory overload, right?
Yeah.
So it's like these platforms are designed to keep us engaged, but sometimes that engagement comes at the cost of our mental well-being.
It's such a good point. I think we often talk about algorithms in this neutral way, but it's important to remember that they're designed with specific goals in mind, right?
Right.
And those goals aren't always what's best for, individual users,
Yeah.
especially for people from marginalized communities.
Right. So we have this tension then between, the potential of these online spaces to create connection
Right.
and community, right?
Absolutely.
And then this reality that those same spaces can perpetuate harm and exclusion, and often in these subtle ways that are hard to even pinpoint.
Yeah. It's very insidious, I think.
Yeah.
And it's something that Hoerricks really grapples with throughout the essay.
Yeah. So we've talked about the meme, the cis gaze, and all these challenges of navigating these online spaces that are so often, designed to kind of reinforce these dominant norms.
Yeah.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about something that I thought was so beautiful and powerful in this essay, which is the poem Crossing Borders.
Yeah.
What stood out to you about this poem?
Well, I think, one of the things that's so striking about it is the imagery. Right? Like there's all this like vivid imagery of color and light and transformation. And it's almost as if Hoerricks is like using these metaphors to kind of depict their own journey of self-discovery.
Yeah, and coming into their own, right.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I felt like there was this really deliberate contrast between the kind of like grayscale limitations of a world that's always trying to impose binaries.
Right.
Right. And then this vibrant, multifaceted reality of Hoerricks' own experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's like they're breaking free from those limitations,
Exactly.
And reclaiming their own narrative, and it's just so full of color.
Yeah, and I think that idea of like reclaiming your narrative is so central to this essay as a whole, right?
Right.
It's about pushing back against all those dominant narratives that try to define trans identity in these, narrow and limiting ways.
Absolutely. And the poem just so beautifully captures that sense of agency
Yeah.
and empowerment, I think.
It really does. It's, crossing borders isn't just about like physical transformation.
Right.
It's about this emotional and spiritual transformation.
Ugh.
It's about breaking free from the constraints of,
Yeah.
Societal expectations and just really embracing
Embracing your true self.
your authentic self. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, speaking of embracing your authentic self, Hoerricks also reflects on the challenges of finding belonging online as a trans autistic person.
Right.
And I think that's another really important layer of this essay.
It's something I think a lot of people can relate to, even if they don't share those specific identities, right? Like the internet can be this source of incredible connection.
Yes.
But it can also be a breeding ground for negativity and exclusion.
Right. And Hoerricks really speaks to that tension between, the potential for community building and then the reality of algorithmic bias, online toxicity.
It's like you're navigating a system that wasn't designed for you, and you're constantly having to push back against these default settings or something.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, it's like we almost have to build our own like digital shelters sometimes,
Yeah.
Find those safe havens within these larger platforms that can feel so hostile or just overwhelming at times.
Right. And Hoerricks actually talks about that.
Yeah.
They talk about anxieties around like platform instability, like the potential for TikTok to disappear,
Right.
and what that could mean for all the communities that
Yeah.
have kind of found refuge there,
Yeah.
and it really highlights this sense of precarity.
Yeah.
Like you're always kind of on edge
Yeah.
because you could lose this space at
Right.
any moment.
Yeah, it resonates with me a lot. It's like
Yeah.
you're always like one algorithm change away from having your whole online world just totally disrupted.
Exactly. And especially for folks who really rely on these online spaces
Yeah.
for support and validation,
Yeah.
people who might not have access to those same resources in their offline lives,
Right.
that instability can be really, really unsettling.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that these platforms, even though they like claim to be neutral,
Yeah.
they actually hold a lot of power over our lives.
Absolutely.
And that power isn't always wielded responsibly.
I think that's a really key takeaway from this essay.
Yeah.
Hoerricks is really urging us to
Mhm.
think critically about the role of technology, right?
Yeah.
Like how it's actually shaping our experiences, especially when it comes to identity and belonging.
So how do we do that? Like how do we move beyond this feeling of helplessness,
Yeah.
and start to reclaim some agency in our digital lives? Because it can feel so daunting.
It can.
It can feel impossible to go up against these like tech giants.
It's true. They do kind of feel like these massive,
Yeah.
impenetrable forces sometimes, but I think there are things we can do.
Okay.
I think first of all, like awareness is huge,
Okay.
right? Just recognizing that these biases exist,
Yeah.
that these algorithms aren't neutral.
Right.
That's like a really crucial first step.
Okay. Yeah.
And once we can kind of acknowledge the problem, then we can start to think about, okay, well, how do we challenge it,
Yeah. Yeah.
both individually and collectively?
Do you have any suggestions for like practical steps that listeners can take? Because it can feel so overwhelming.
It can, yeah.
Like, where do you even begin?
Right. Well, I mean, it sounds so simple,
Yeah.
but I think being more intentional
Okay.
about the content that we consume
Okay.
and share online, that's huge, right? Like,
Right.
who are we supporting? What kind of messages are we amplifying?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then supporting creators and communities who are actually trying to build more inclusive
Yeah.
and equitable digital spaces, I think is really important too,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And then, advocating for policies
Yeah.
that actually hold these platforms accountable
Right.
for the harm that they perpetuate.
It's a good reminder that even those small actions can have a ripple effect,
They can
Especially when we act collectively.
Exactly, yeah.
It's about shifting the culture, I guess.
How things
Moving away from this idea that technology is neutral.
Yeah.
And starting to demand more from these platforms that we use,
I agree.
both in terms of their design and their impact on society as a whole.
Absolutely.
Hoerricks also talks about the importance of finding and building community online,
Yes.
despite all these challenges, right?
Yeah.
And they actually share some really moving reflections on the friendships they formed
Yeah.
and the support that they've received through those digital connections, which I thought was really beautiful.
I mean, those moments of connection, right?
Yeah.
Of finding people who just get it,
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
understand and validate your experiences. That can be so powerful, especially for people who often feel, marginalized or misunderstood
Yeah.
in offline spaces.
Yeah, there's so much negativity around like online interactions these days.
Yeah, it's true.
It's easy to forget about that potential for good,
Right.
for genuine human connection.
For sure.
And reading those passages in the essay was really heartening.
It's a good reminder that technology isn't inherently good or bad, right?
Right.
It's a tool,
Yeah.
and how we use it
Yeah.
is really up to us.
Right. Right.
And I think Hoerricks is showing us that even within these flawed and often frustrating platforms,
Yeah.
there's still room for hope,
Yeah.
for resistance,
Yeah.
for building something better.
It makes me think about that concept of digital resilience,
Yeah.
It's not just about surviving in these spaces, but it's about actively shaping them,
Yes.
creating pockets of joy and resistance, even in the face of all this adversity.
Absolutely. And I think that's what Hoerricks is ultimately calling for, right?
Sure.
It's like more mindful and intentional
Yeah.
and compassionate approach
Yeah.
to our digital lives.
Yeah.
One that recognizes both the challenges and the possibilities
Yeah.
of this, ever-evolving landscape.
This has been such an insightful conversation.
It has.
I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of what
Yeah.
Hoerricks is exploring in in their essay.
For sure.
Are there any final thoughts that you want to share before we wrap up this part of our deep dive?
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that we don't have to just be like passive consumers of technology.
Yeah.
You know, we have the power to shape the digital world,
Right.
to demand better
Yeah.
from the platforms that we use, and to actually create online spaces
Yeah.
that are truly inclusive and affirming for everyone.
Yeah.
And I think it starts with just recognizing our own agency
Yeah.
and using our voices to advocate for that change.
Beautifully said.
Thank you.
Okay, deep divers, we'll be back in just a bit to wrap up our exploration of From Gray to Light.
Looking forward to it.
Don't go anywhere. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into From Gray to Light.
I feel like we could talk about this essay for hours.
I know, me too.
It's so much to unpack.
One thing that I keep coming back to is this idea of the statistical mean that Hoerricks mentions.
Yeah.
It's just such a powerful way to describe how these platforms often cater to the majority
Right.
and leave those who exist outside those norms to, like, fend for themselves.
It's almost like they're designed with this, like, hypothetical average user in mind.
Right.
But that average user doesn't actually represent the vast diversity of human experience.
Exactly. Yeah. And when you design systems around a hypothetical average,
Right.
you inevitably exclude those who don't fit the mold.
You do.
And this is especially true for marginalized groups who are already underrepresented in tech spaces.
Absolutely. And that lack of representation
Yeah.
gets reflected in everything, right?
Yeah.
The algorithms, the content moderation policies, the very structure of the platforms themselves.
It's like a self-perpetuating cycle. Right. The less representation you have, the less likely it is that your needs are going to be considered
That's right.
in the design and development of these technologies.
And the more likely you are to encounter,
Yeah.
harm and bias and exclusion.
So what can we do about it? Because it feels so overwhelming to, like, think about changing these systems that seems so ingrained and resistant to change.
Yeah, it's definitely not an easy task.
Right.
But I do think Hoerricks' essay offers some clues,
Okay.
some starting points for thinking about how we might create a more equitable and inclusive digital world.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, okay, so for example, they talk about challenging binary thinking,
Okay.
right? Which is so pervasive in our culture, especially online.
Right.
It's about recognizing the spectrum of human experience and identities
Yeah.
and actually designing platforms that can accommodate that complexity.
Yeah, that's so important, I think.
It's crucial. I mean, moving beyond binary thinking
Mm-hmm.
is essential if we want to create spaces where everyone feels
Yeah.
seen and valued, regardless of, where they fall on any given spectrum.
And it requires a shift in mindset, right?
It does.
It's like a willingness to listen and learn from people who have been marginalized
Yes,
or excluded by these technologies.
absolutely. Yeah.
Like, we need to center the voices and experiences of those who are most impacted by these issues.
It's not enough to just create spaces
Yeah.
for marginalized groups to speak.
Right.
We need to actually listen to what they're saying
Yeah.
and use that knowledge to inform the design and development of these platforms.
It's about co-creation, right?
It is.
Working together to build a digital world that reflects, like, the values of inclusivity and equity.
Yeah, and I think it's also about recognizing that technology is not neutral.
Right, right.
It's shaped by the people who create it,
Yeah.
the values they hold, the choices they make.
And we have a responsibility to demand better from the tech industry, to push for more ethical and inclusive design practices.
Absolutely.
And we also have a responsibility, I think, to be mindful of our own online behavior, like to think about how our actions are contributing
Right.
to the culture of these spaces.
Are we amplifying harmful content?
Right.
Are we using our platforms to advocate for positive change?
Yeah. Yeah. Those are great questions I think we should all be asking ourselves.
All the time.
Yeah, for sure.
It's about personal accountability as much as it is about, systemic change.
Right, right.
We all have a role to play
Hmm.
in shaping the digital world that we want to live in.
Well said. That's a perfect note to end on, I think.
Yeah.
Hoerricks' essay has given us so much to think about,
Really, guys.
so many threads to kind of unravel.
For sure.
It's a reminder that the conversation about trans identity in the digital age it's complex,
It is.
it's multifaceted, and there are no easy answers.
There aren't.
But, by engaging in these conversations, By listening to diverse voices and by challenging the status quo,
Right.
I think we can start to move towards a more just and equitable online world for everyone.
I hope so.
Yeah, I hope so too.
Me too.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into From Gray to Light.
Thank you for having me.
It's been such a pleasure.
It really has.
We hope it's sparked some new ideas.
Yeah.
And inspired you to think critically about the role of technology
Absolutely.
in your own life and in the world around you.
It's important.
It is. It's crucial. So until next time, deep divers.
See you.